Colonel Rebecca Green walks into a small supermarket on a peaceful weekend afternoon in Dallas, Texas. Dressed casually in a white shirt, blue jeans, and sneakers, she blends in effortlessly with the crowd of ordinary customers, her humble appearance belying the truth. No one could have imagined that this woman, with a calm demeanor, had spent her entire career defending her country, commanding hundreds of soldiers in intense, high-stakes environments. Rebecca enjoys these quiet moments, simple tasks like picking up groceries, after a long and demanding day. But not long after this peaceful moment, everything changes, sparked by an action that would reveal the true nature of a person. At the end of the aisle, a tall man in a police uniform, Officer Daniel Harris, accidentally drops a packet of chips and a bottle of soda on the floor. Rebecca watches, and then notices something strange. Harris glances at the mess but simply walks away, leaving the items behind. The lack of responsibility in his actions catches Rebecca's attention. Trained to pay attention to detail and take ownership in everything she does, she couldn't let this go unnoticed. And so, she steps forward, ready to confront the officer and remind him of the duty that comes with wearing the uniform. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the peaceful neighborhood. In the midst of this calm, Rebecca Green, a woman with striking auburn hair, dressed casually in a loose white blouse and faded jeans, walked into the local supermarket. Her movements were calm, unhurried, as she browsed the aisles, picking up items she needed for the week. She was just like any other shopper in the store, blending into the crowd, unassuming and humble. What no one could guess, however, was that Rebecca was not just an ordinary woman. She had spent the last 15 years serving her country, commanding operations and leading her troops through hostile territories. As a lieutenant colonel in the army, Rebecca had faced dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. Her career was marked by high-stakes missions and countless hours spent in the most challenging environments on Earth. But here, in this small-town supermarket, she sought only a moment of peace, a brief respite from the chaos of her career. But peace, as it often does, was fleeting. At the end of the aisle, she spotted a figure in a police uniform, a tall, broad-shouldered man who seemed completely oblivious to the world around him. Officer Daniel Harris was standing by the snack aisle, his hands full with a few items, when suddenly a packet of chips slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Without a second thought, he let out a small huff of frustration, gave the packet a cursory glance, and walked away. The packet of chips remained on the floor, unnoticed by anyone else in the area. Rebecca, however, couldn't let it slide. Her military training had taught her that accountability and attention to detail were non-negotiable. She had spent years in high-pressure situations where every detail mattered. And the lack of responsibility displayed by Harris didn't sit right with her. She approached the officer, her voice calm but firm as she addressed him. "Excuse me, sir," she began, making sure her tone carried the appropriate weight of someone who understood the importance of duty. "You dropped your chips. Shouldn't you pick them up? It's a simple gesture of respect for the others around." Harris turned to her slowly, the irritation on his face clear as he looked her over with dismissive eyes. "And who do you think you are?" he shot back with a smirk. "I don't have time for trivial things like this. Let someone else deal with it." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, but her expression remained neutral. "As a police officer, it's your duty to set an example. Respect for others is something we should all practice, regardless of what our uniform says." The officer chuckled darkly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can teach me about responsibility?" he sneered. "You're just another woman in a store thinking she can tell people what to do. Get real." The tension in the air was palpable. Shoppers who had been wandering the aisles slowly began to turn their attention to the exchange, some pulling out their phones to capture the moment. But Rebecca stood her ground, unflinching. She had faced far worse than this, and she would not be intimidated by a man too proud to acknowledge his mistake. "You're wrong," Rebecca replied calmly, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "This isn't about me. It's about the principle of doing what's right. You, as a member of law enforcement, have a duty to lead by example. It's not just about picking up a packet of chips. It's about showing respect to everyone around you." Harris didn't seem to hear her. His eyes narrowed with contempt, and he crossed his arms, unwilling to back down. "You think your little speech is going to change anything?" he sneered. "I'm a cop. People listen to me, not the other way around." But Rebecca's resolve only strengthened. She wasn't about to back down from what she knew was right. The standoff continued, the small supermarket now feeling more like a battlefield, with the crowd watching, waiting for something to break. Would Rebecca stand her ground? Or would the officer's arrogance win the day? The answer, as Rebecca knew well, was not about what was at stake for her. It was about showing everyone around her that doing what's right, even in the smallest of actions, was always worth the fight. The tension in the supermarket grew thicker with each passing moment. Rebecca stood tall, unwavering in her position, while Officer Harris continued to smirk at her as if he had all the time in the world. The shoppers who had gathered around began to whisper among themselves, some muttering words of encouragement, others unsure of how to react. The glow of their phone screens illuminated the dim aisles as they filmed the escalating confrontation. Rebecca could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but it didn't faze her. She had been in more high-stakes situations before, facing challenges much more dangerous than a disgruntled officer in a supermarket. But what she was doing here, standing up for something as simple as picking up a packet of chips, was bigger than just this moment. It was a reminder to everyone present that integrity and responsibility mattered, no matter how small the act. "You really think this is a big deal? Huh?" Harris mocked, his voice rising slightly. His arrogance was starting to show cracks, and he didn't like it. "You've got a lot of nerve lecturing me, lady. Just because you wore a uniform once doesn't mean you know anything about my job." His words were laced with contempt, and the bitterness in his tone only served to fuel Rebecca's determination. "I've spent my career teaching people to do the right thing," Rebecca replied, her voice as calm as ever. "And it's not about uniforms or ranks. It's about being accountable. If you can't take responsibility for something as simple as picking up a packet of chips, how can anyone trust you with bigger responsibilities?" Harris let out a scoffing laugh, clearly irritated by her words. But it was starting to sink in. Her calmness, her ability to stand her ground, was starting to unnerve him. He shifted his weight, and for a split second, Rebecca saw his confidence falter. But only for a moment. "Enough of this," Harris growled, taking a step toward her. "You're just some old veteran who thinks she can lecture me. I don't need to take this from you." Rebecca remained unmoved. "You may not like what I'm saying," she said, locking eyes with him, "but you need to hear it. You've got a responsibility to everyone around you. When you wear that uniform, you represent the law. And what you've done, your attitude, your refusal to take accountability, makes all of us question what that law really stands for." The supermarket was nearly silent now, with the crowd frozen in place, watching every word, every movement. The tension was palpable, and yet Rebecca's composure remained unbroken. She could feel the weight of the moment, the importance of what she was standing for. It wasn't just about the packet of chips. It wasn't even just about Officer Harris. It was about reminding people that actions, no matter how small, mattered. They had consequences. Harris, clearly rattled, attempted to regain control of the situation. You think you're some kind of hero? Huh? Some kind of champion of justice? He sneered, puffing out his chest. I don't need to take lessons from someone like you. This is nothing but a waste of my time. Rebecca took a slow, deliberate breath. She had seen this type of reaction before, when people felt threatened. They resorted to insults, mockery, and arrogance. But none of that could break her. You're mistaken, she said quietly but firmly. This isn't about being a hero. It's about doing what's right. It's about setting an example for others. Because the truth is, people are always watching. And when they see someone in power act with arrogance and disrespect, it sends a message that they can do the same. But when they see someone stand up for what's right, it shows them that we have a choice, that we can rise above the bad examples and do better. Harris glared at her, but now, his bravado was starting to crumble. His chest, which had once been puffed out in defiance, seemed to shrink ever so slightly. He was no longer the man in control of the situation. The crowd, still watching intently, seemed to shift in their stance, lessening their judgment of Rebecca and beginning to focus on the officer, who now looked more uncomfortable with every passing second. Rebecca took another step forward. You may think this is just about me, she said softly, but it's not. This is about all of us. The people you serve, the people who look up to you, who trust you. You have a responsibility to them. And when you forget that, when you stop caring about the little things, things like respect and accountability, that's when you lose everything. Her words hung in the air like a weight. And for a moment, the supermarket was silent, the tension thick enough to cut through. Harris was no longer laughing. His eyes darted nervously around the room. And Rebecca could sense the doubt creeping in. His words had stopped. And for the first time in this confrontation, it was as if the power dynamic had shifted. At that moment, the door to the store opened, and two more police officers walked in, drawn by the whispers that had started circulating. The presence of the new officers seemed to break the silence. But it didn't change the fact that Harris was now facing more than just Rebecca's calm reprimand. You're still here, huh? One of the new officers asked, looking at Harris with confusion. What's going on? Harris hesitated, then turned his attention back to Rebecca. This woman is just causing trouble. She thinks she knows everything. Rebecca, however, was already one step ahead. She knew that the moment was coming when it was no longer just about her standing up to an arrogant officer. It was about making sure that the right thing was done. She pulled her phone from her pocket, dialed a number, and waited for the call to connect. As she did, she locked eyes with Harris, and for the first time in their confrontation, she saw something different in his expression, uncertainty. The call was answered. Rebecca's voice, steady and clear, broke through the tension in the air. Hello. I need assistance at the Central Market. There's a police officer here who is misusing his power. His actions have been witnessed by several people. And I need immediate support. She paused for a moment, then continued. This is a matter of public trust. I'll wait for your arrival. The officer on the other end of the line didn't hesitate. We're on our way. As Rebecca ended the call, the weight of the moment settled over her. This wasn't over yet. Harris still hadn't taken responsibility for his actions. But now, it wasn't just about what she could do alone. It was about holding people accountable. Together, the supermarket seemed to hold its breath. The crowd watching in silence. Everyone was waiting. Would the officers arrive in time? Would Harris be forced to face the consequences of his actions? The tension was building, but Rebecca stood strong, unwavering in her mission. The atmosphere in the supermarket had shifted. What began as a simple dispute had escalated into something much larger, a confrontation between right and wrong. Power and integrity, respect and arrogance. The tension in the store was thick, with onlookers now holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Rebecca Green stood her ground, unwavering, while Officer Harris, though still defiant, was beginning to lose his confidence. The silence was broken by the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The unmistakable wail of police cars approaching seemed to make the air even more charged. Harris, once puffed up with pride, now looked uncomfortable, glancing around nervously as the realization dawned on him. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was something much bigger, and he could feel the tide of public opinion turning against him. Rebecca, calm and composed, remained unfazed by the growing tension. She had been in situations where lives were on the line, where every decision mattered, but this was different. This was a battle for principle, for fairness, for the integrity of those who wore the badge. She had made her stand. Now, all she had to do was wait for the arrival of the authorities. As the police cars pulled into the parking lot, the tension in the supermarket reached its peak. The first officers to arrive quickly surveyed the scene, their eyes scanning the crowd, taking in the whispered conversations. The phones pointed in their direction, the palpable unease in the air. The new officers walked over to Harris, who had begun to shrink under the weight of the attention. He tried to stand tall, but his previous bravado had all but vanished. He now seemed less like the confident officer he had been moments ago and more like a man desperately trying to hold on to the shreds of his dignity. "You called for support?" one of the officers asked, looking at Rebecca, then at Harris. "Yeah," Rebecca replied, her voice firm but controlled. "This officer here has been acting with a complete lack of responsibility. He has refused to acknowledge a simple act of accountability, picking up a packet of chips he dropped. And when I pointed it out, he responded with disdain, even threatening me. I've already contacted the mayor's office about this matter." The officer looked between Rebecca and Harris. He had seen situations like this before, but something about this one felt different. Harris, despite his uniform, was clearly out of line, and the crowd surrounding them had started to become more vocal. "What exactly happened here?" the second officer asked, addressing Harris. Harris stood there, his back stiff, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sense of uncertainty. This lady," he began, his voice now tinged with defensive anger, "was just giving me trouble over a packet of chips. I told her I didn't have time for this, and she started lecturing me about my duties." The second officer raised an eyebrow. "You didn't pick up the chips?" he asked, his tone neutral, yet clearly indicating that this was no small matter. "No," Harris muttered, his eyes darting to the crowd. "But it's not a big deal." Rebecca stepped forward. "It's not just about the chips," she said, her voice calm but piercing. "It's about the principle of taking responsibility for your actions. It's about the example you set as an officer of the law. You should never dismiss your duty, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem." Harris scoffed but didn't argue further. The pressure of the situation was building, and the weight of his actions was becoming harder to ignore. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, and he knew they were all waiting for something to happen. The sirens outside were a reminder that the authorities had been alerted, and his time to escape had run out. Before he could react, the mayor of Dallas, Andrew Preston, arrived on the scene, His presence brought a sudden shift in the air. A man known for his no-nonsense approach to leadership. Andrew was a tall figure, his gaze sharp and commanding. He walked directly toward Rebecca, his face softening when he recognized her. "Colonel Green," he said with a nod of respect. "I'm sorry you've had to deal with this." Rebecca acknowledged him with a simple nod. "Thank you, Mayor Preston. But this isn't just about me. It's about what happened here today. About ensuring that the law is upheld with integrity, regardless of who's wearing the badge." Andrew turned his attention to Harris, his expression hardening. "You are the officer involved in this?" he asked coldly. Harris stood rigidly, his confidence now shattered. "Yes, sir," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it once had. "I've been informed about what happened," Andrew said, his voice calm but carrying authority. "And I won't let this go unaddressed." Rebecca could see that the mayor was a man of action, and she felt a brief surge of relief. She knew that he would ensure this matter was dealt with appropriately. But she also knew that this moment was far from over. "You're right," Andrew continued, turning to address both officers. "This situation should have been handled differently from the beginning. Officer Harris, your actions today reflect poorly not only on you but on the entire police force. I'll be taking immediate steps to ensure that this is investigated thoroughly." Harris looked stunned. "Wait, sir, he started, but Andrew held up his hand, silencing him. "Save it," Andrew said. "We have witnesses. We have video evidence. And I'm not going to let anyone abuse their power under my watch." With a quick motion, he turned to the officers behind him. "Take Officer Harris into custody. He's suspended effective immediately, and we'll begin an investigation. His conduct today cannot be ignored." The two officers quickly moved to detain Harris, who stood frozen, his face pale as the gravity of his actions began to sink in. His pride was gone, replaced by a deep sense of regret. As they escorted him out of the supermarket, the crowd watched in silence, some whispering to each other, others simply shaking their heads at the display of arrogance and entitlement they had just witnessed. Rebecca remained calm, her eyes following the officers as they led Harris away. She didn't feel triumphant, nor did she want any public recognition. She had done what she believed was right, and that was all that mattered. The crowd, however, had begun to murmur in admiration. Some applauded, while others simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. As the mayor turned back to Rebecca, his expression softened. "Colonel Green," he said, "I'm grateful for your actions today. It's people like you who keep us all accountable, who remind us that the law is about integrity, not just power. You've done something important here." Rebecca simply nodded, a quiet pride settling in her chest. "I didn't do it for recognition," she replied. "I did it because it's what's right." The crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension in the supermarket starting to ease. Yet, for Rebecca Green, the weight of what had just transpired hung heavily in the air. She had made her stand. But now came the aftermath, the fallout of what would surely be a larger conversation about accountability and abuse of power. The mayor, Andrew Preston, gave her a respectful nod before heading off to coordinate the next steps. Rebecca remained in place, taking in the aftermath of the scene. Despite the apparent resolution, she could feel the lingering eyes of the crowd. The people who had watched this confrontation unfold were not just passive observers anymore. They were witnesses to something larger. They had seen how a simple act of accountability, one woman standing up for what was right, had exposed something far more sinister. And they had felt the power of integrity in the face of arrogance. As the sound of the police car sirens faded into the distance, signaling that Officer Harris had been taken into custody. Rebecca couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't about defeating him. It was about restoring faith in the system, showing that justice and integrity still had a place in a world where power often went unchecked. But as the events unfolded, she also knew that the true battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The media picked up the story quickly. The footage of Harris's outburst and his subsequent removal from the supermarket spread like wildfire on social media. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for Rebecca went viral, with countless people voicing their support for her and condemning the officer's behavior. Articles appeared in local news outlets, some praising Rebecca for her courage, while others criticized Harris for his actions. The debate quickly shifted beyond just the supermarket incident. It became a wider discussion about the responsibilities of law enforcement and the importance of integrity in public service. The next few days were a whirlwind for Rebecca. She was contacted by news outlets, interviewed by local TV stations, and even invited to speak at a community forum. While she appreciated the recognition, she felt uneasy with all the attention. For her, the cause had always been the same, doing what was right, no matter the cost. But now, the spotlight was on her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to carry the weight of it. In the meantime, Officer Harris's career was unraveling. The investigation into his conduct moved quickly, and within days, he was officially suspended from the force. The video evidence, coupled with multiple witness testimonies, left him with little room to defend his actions. He was accused of misconduct, abuse of power, and failure to uphold the law he had sworn to protect. Public opinion, once in Harris's favor, quickly turned. People who had once seen him as a respected officer began to distance themselves. Former colleagues within the police force expressed their disappointment in his behavior. Local leaders and community activists called for reform. And the city of Dallas faced the very real challenge of regaining the public's trust in its law enforcement. Harris, once proud of his uniform, was now facing the very real consequences of his arrogance and disrespect. As for Rebecca, she continued her work in the army, doing what she did best, leading with integrity, holding herself and those around her accountable, and fostering respect in all things. She didn't seek the limelight. In fact, she had always been someone who preferred to stay in the background, doing the job she loved without needing recognition. But what had happened at the supermarket had become a turning point. Not just for her, but for the community as a whole. One evening, as Rebecca sat in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had transpired, she received a call from Mayor Preston. "Colonel Green," he began, his tone sincere, "I just wanted to thank you once again for your actions. What you did wasn't just about one officer. It was about the message it sent to our community. Your courage has inspired people to speak up, to demand more from those in positions of power. We are already starting to see changes in the way people are thinking about accountability. And that's thanks to you." Rebecca smiled, though the weight of everything still felt heavy on her shoulders. "I appreciate that, Mayor, but I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I believe in fairness. I believe in justice. And that's why you're the right person to lead the next phase." Mayor Preston continued, "We're starting a citywide initiative aimed at police reform, responsibility, and building better relationships between the law enforcement and the community. And I want you to be a key part of that effort. Your voice, your experience, could make a real difference." Rebecca was silent for a moment. She had spent her life serving her country, defending its values, and fighting for the greater good. But this was different. This wasn't just a military mission. This was a chance to shape the future of her city. To ensure that what happened with Harris would never happen again. "I'll do it," she said, her voice resolute. "I'll help. Mayor, it's time for change." The call ended, and Rebecca sat back in her chair, her thoughts racing. She had fought for justice in the field, in battle, but this was a different kind of fight. It wasn't about combat, it was about changing a system. About ensuring that fairness and accountability didn't just exist on paper, but in practice. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca worked alongside community leaders, law enforcement experts, and citizens to help craft new policies aimed at promoting integrity within the police force. She spoke at seminars, participated in panels, and helped train new recruits on the importance of respect, responsibility, and accountability. Her story, once just a quiet tale of standing up for what was right, had turned into a movement, a catalyst for change in her city. As for Officer Harris, his downfall continued. Not only was he removed from the force, but the media coverage of his disgrace spread far beyond Dallas. He was no longer the man in the uniform, the man who once held power and respect. He had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that power, when abused, comes with a price. But Rebecca, she never sought fame. She never wanted to be a hero. Her fight was never about recognition. It was about the values she had sworn to uphold. And now, as she stood before a room full of future officers, teaching them about responsibility, integrity, and the weight of the uniform they wore, she realized that her fight had only just begun. The journey toward a more just society was long, and the challenges were many. But as Rebecca Green stood in front of those young recruits, she knew that her legacy would be one of courage and conviction, a reminder that, in the end, doing what's right is always worth the cost.